So the desktop ekphrasis for today begins in a slightly different way than I've performed these particular segments in this particular series before, with a selected image. And this image is of Helena Hutchins, who was recently um, killed as the result of what appears to be an accidental incident with a loaded prop gun, that I'm not even sure why the gun was fired. But what I want to talk about is gun violence, and I had just done a piece in which I talked about a work that Felix Gonzalez Torres did in 1990, which was called Death by Gun. And it was a conceptual piece in which images and references to individuals, who were murdered or killed, not necessarily murdered, I suppose. But, the large part of gun deaths is non-accidental, right? And in this case, it probably is an accident. But Helena, Hutchins, if this were an incident that had occurred when Felix Gonzalez Torres did his work, could have been found, herself. We could have found her, because she couldn't have found herself because she doesn't exist anymore, does she? So we could have found her on that list if this incident had occurred in the year that he made this piece. And the reason that I want to talk about it is, not singularly because of the tragedy of a single individual's death, but to question, why the prop gun was there and why it was needed in the first place. And the reason that it was there is that Hollywood, perpetuates a certain kind of mythology of the world that it attempts to represent, and that world, is often filled with violence and action and death and murder and intrigue, and it belongs, to this mythology of the mechanics and stagings and plots of death and murder, and so guns are a staple in the productions of culture that Hollywood produces, and if guns weren't a staple, and if that particular narrative, that particular mythology that Hollywood perpetuates were a different story, were a different narrative, there wouldn't, Hollywood wouldn't require the use of so many prop guns, and Helena Hutchins, might still be alive because the movie that she made might not have had that particular tool available to it. So I want to talk a little bit about how Hollywood, perpetuates the romanticization of guns and gun violence, and how that romanticization supports positions like the NRA's position on this sort of unquestionable right to possess these weapons that kill our children in grade schools and junior high schools and high schools, and that result in mass killings and shootings, and that result in all types of accidents, and ultimately in a lot of destruction of human life. And Hollywood, very seldom takes responsibility for the stereotypes that it produces. And when called on those stereotypes, you remember when, and I don't recall exactly what year it was, but when Marlon Brando, won an Oscar, and instead of, the typical acceptance speech, he got up and he had someone with him, and this woman made a statement on behalf of rights of Native Americans, and she was booed and berated by the audience, and then and Brando suffered the consequences for this. He was very articulate in a follow-up interview that he did on the Dick Cavett show concerning why he did it, and he was very articulate, concerning the way that stereotypes produced by Hollywood and that continue to be produced by Hollywood, particularly in relationship to individuals within positionalities that are marginalized by society, and that would include not only Native American individuals, but African American individuals, individuals with disabilities. That these stereotypes are perpetuated in large part within the culture industry and of Hollywood. So I'm not interested in this tragedy from the perspective of whether Alec Baldwin was guilty or not, and that's an issue that needs to be decided elsewhere. But what I'm concerned with is the way that the framing of, and even in NPR, National Public Radio, the framing of this issue doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is that not whether this was an intentional act of violence or not, but why the gun was there in the first place, and I've done a lot of work on the issue of gun violence over the years, and one of the difficulties in addressing the matter is cultural perception of what the possession of a gun means, right? And a lack of understanding of the history of the police use of deadly weapons and excessive force, for one thing, and how that is an outgrowth of not only racism, but the history of slavery and human captivity in the United States, and also how the glorification and glamorization of gun use in the Western, is also a result of these myths that support lies that we tell ourselves and to justify colonialist projects like Manifest Destiny, and they're filled with these sort of patriarchal myths of male bravado and courage and heroism that really belie the violence at the core of this. So when John Wayne and Clint Eastwood and these other actors perform in these genres, they're performing in genres of violence and glorification of this certain kind of masculinist project that Hollywood produces and that perpetuate not only racial stereotypes, but the stereotype of masculinity as basically a project of violence. So without talking about whether Alec Baldwin was guilty or not, it's interesting to me that the gun was in the hand of a man, and that a woman was killed, and 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 uh, and that tragedy in this instance is exceeds the boundaries of representation, obviously, but the cultural product that Hollywood creates through these myths and narratives of violence also exceeds the boundary of representation, right? So that this particular form of violence and this particular myth is naturalized to the culture. And so I'm hoping that there will be a new Brando in the next Hollywood Awards ceremony, and that this new Brando will, bless you, that's Leo in the background sneezing, and that this new Brando will, also refuse her award, and instead we'll discuss Hollywood's perpetuation of the naturalization, naturalizing and reifying, this idea of the normalness of violence in our culture, and I'm hoping that somehow Hollywood will see the connection between the tragedy of this incident and the way that their relationship to guns and the imagery of gun use and the narratives and plots and stories of action films and westerns and all of these other genres and domains that support our understanding of ourselves and create viable positionalities in the cultural imagination that refuse to recognize that this sort of world filled with death and tragedy is really not acceptable to us, and that's why I chose this image, and that's why this particular I and just to add an afterthought to this, I was thinking about the way that certain centers of the cultural imagination radiate, and these centers can radiate in positive or negative ways. So cultural icons like LeBron James, who support Black Lives Matter and who return money to communities that lack resources, and who encourage education and encourage healthy relationships to self-knowledge and culture, can radiate in really positive ways. And but but the opposite is also true, and Hollywood is the center of the dissemination of the cultural imagination, right? So it can disseminate these ideologies that are like radium, right? That this is radioactive material that contaminates and destroys human life. And in terms of the representation of gun use in Hollywood culture, this is very much what it is. It's a radium of the cultural imagination, and it should be held accountable for the destruction that it produces. And and I'm hoping that someone will be able to recognize that and to make that statement.